Good morning and happy Sabbath. We are continuing our study of Genesis. Today we look at week 8, the promise. Please join me in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise you and we hope that you can bless us today that are giving these lessons. Please send us the Holy Spirit to be with us for guidance and to watch over us and to give us insight into expanding the meaning of these lessons. We pray all of this in your loving name. Amen. This week's lessons take us to the climax in Abraham's religious journey. The sacrifice of Isaac. This is a sacrifice test of Abram's faith. We will explore a number of items. What is the meaning of this test? Why did God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son in contradiction to his promise? How will God provide? Why did the sacrifice change from Isaac to the expectation of a lamb and finally to a ram? And lesson themes are significance of atonement and the power of prayer. For Saturday, our memory text is from Genesis 24, verse 1. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. So the promised son of Isaac was born to Sarah and Abraham at the set time God had spoken to them. The story is far from over and reaches a climatic moment when Abraham takes his son Isaac to Mount Moriah to be sacrificed. The astonishing and troubling story does reveal more of the plan of salvation. And we will explore the sacrifice in Sunday's lesson. The family of Abraham must have been shaken by the sacrifice, and the future was not clear for Abraham. In all of this, Sarah dies after the sacrifice at Moriah, and Isaac remains single. Moving to Sunday, and the lesson title is, in fact, Mount Moriah. God's powerful test of Abraham is chronicled in chapter 22 of Genesis. And we'll be covering, starting out in chapter 22, verses 1 through 12. And in verse 1, now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Then God said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. Verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. Excuse me, I'm going to put this in for my throat. And saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far off. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. And notes I have from the Clear Word Bible talked about that in verse 5, Abraham actually states, we will come back to you. And I read 3 different Bible accounts, and the Bible indicates that Abraham was clearly distraught, which he should be, and had feelings of guilt about what he was getting ready to do. But he had come to the belief that since God had promised him he would have descendants, that one possible outcome would be God solving the problem by possibly raising Isaac from the dead. In verse 6, as we continue, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 men went together. Verse 7, but Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. And from my study Bible in verses 5 through 8, Abraham's obedience is based on faith. He believes God will provide the sacrifice. And as an aside, the word worship in verse 5 means to bow oneself close to the ground. Continuing, verse 9. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. So Isaac was a young man who could have easily overpowered his father. That he agreed to be bound for sacrifice says much about Isaac's own faith and his character. In verse 10, and Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And again, from my study Bible, these verses don't imply that God is just now learning that Abraham fears him. God is omniscient. The angel of the Lord is saying to Abraham, by your faithful actions, I experientially know that you fear God. So what was the purpose of this test and why in such a powerful way? This test provided a judgment that was required to know what was in the heart of Abraham. Abraham had run the risk of losing his future posterity, but he did what God asked. As the lesson states, what is faith if not trust in what we don't see or fully understand? A few comments from Sister Ellen G. White about this particular lesson. God had called Abraham to be the father of the faithful, and his life was to stand as an example of faith to succeeding generations. But his faith had not been perfect. He had shown distrust of God in concealing the fact that Sarah was his wife, and again in his marriage with Hagar. That he might reach the highest standard, God subjected him to another test, the closest which man was ever called to endure. In a vision of the night, he was directed to repair to the land of Moriah and there offer up his son as a burnt offering upon a mountain that should be known to him. At the time of receiving this command, Abraham had reached the age of 120 years. He was regarded as an old man, even in his generation. In his earlier years, he had been strong to endure the hardship and brave danger, but now the ardor of his youth had passed away. One in the vigor of manhood may with courage meet difficulties and afflictions that would cause the heart to fail later in life. When his feet are faltering toward the grave, but God had reserved his last, most trying test for Abraham until he longed for rest from anxiety and toil. And that was from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 147. So Abraham was tested at probably one of his weakest moments in his life. Moving on to Monday, the lesson there is called God Will Provide. And we're continuing in Genesis chapter 22 after Isaac was spared. Verse 13, Abraham wept for joy, untied Isaac's hands, and then saw a ram caught by its horns in some of the bushes. Quickly they got the animal, and Abraham offered the sacrifice God had provided in place of his son. Verse 14, so Abraham named the place Jehovah Jireh, meaning the Lord sees and provides. Ever since then, the people have called the place the mountains where the Lord provided. And if we recall in Genesis 22, verse 8, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two went together. The Hebrew verbal form can actually mean God will provide himself as the lamb. We see here the plan of salvation, with the Lord himself suffering and paying in himself the penalty of our sins. On Mount Moriah, long before the cross, the sacrificial lamb caught in the thicket was pointing right to Jesus. From this lesson, he is the one that is seen, as Abraham explains later, in the mount where the Lord is seen. And Jesus himself had pointed to Abraham's prophetic utterance in John 8, verse 56. Abraham looked forward to the time when I would come. In a vision, he saw my day and was glad. So Abraham experienced the agony of possibly having to sacrifice his only son. Abraham understood the coming sacrifice that would be made by God for man's redemption. And that takes us through my lessons for this week, and we'll be moving forward to Tuesday, the death of Sarah. And that his sister Susan has that for us. And that's coming right after the lessons that I taught. So this is a jam-packed 5 lessons this week. Susan, please go ahead and let us know what's happening here.
Yes, indeed, Brother Leela. It is jam-packed, and it's jam-packed with so much truth. And this lesson, this week's lesson, has just been emotionally in God's favor of how he has kept his promise to our faithfulness and to the faithfulness, of course, of Abraham. And this lesson is Tuesday's the death of Sarah. And it gives us a little brief introduction. There are some things to look forward to in talking about verse 22 and 23, which is prior, that was the birth of Rebecca. And we're going to see the good news about Rebecca later on in anticipation with her life. And further down, it talks about later on in verses, Genesis 25, of course, now after the death of Sarah, Abraham will have future marriages and with Keturah. So, but at this time, we're going to be talking about Genesis 23, Sarah's death. And, you know, we've always known it was Sarah and Abraham. It's just like, that's just the item. That's, you say one, you say the other. So Sarah and Abraham, and I say that to say that his love for her was just that deep. It says that she lived 37 years after Isaac was born. The Lord is so gracious. Even in her late years of having him, he allowed her to see him become a man. And that within itself is just love. So at 127 years old, she died in the land of Canaan. And Abraham wept. And I'm sure it makes it sound like a little soft sentence, but I'm sure he deeply wept over Sarah, because next he wanted to give her the best send-off or the best burial he could. And he wanted to do it in that land of Canaan. And it was just a place where he wanted to specifically to bury her. So he went to the leaders of the Hittites and he asked them for a plot of land to bury his wife on, to keep the remembrance of her and to give her the best that he could have. And what's so good about that? These were the descendants of Heth. But what was so good about that? There was no contention, no fussing, no anything. They told him they knew who he was. He was the prince. He was a leader, a faithful man of God. Any portion you want, you may have it. No fuss. He didn't have to beg or anything. So he asked them, well, they asked the son of Zor, who was Ephraim, about a certain plot that was at the end of Ephraim's land. And I think they call it the cave. There was a cave there of Machpelah, if I'm pronouncing it right. That's what he wanted. And he wanted them to ask Ephraim for that. But Ephraim overheard him talking to the leaders of the Hittite. And he said to him, in other words, indeed, there is no question, whatever you want. Now, Abraham was not somebody who took the fact of his good character to be enough. He was also a righteous man. He wanted to pay for it. And I mean, not give him $20 or 20 cents. He wanted to give whatever. He offered 400 silver shillings for it, silver pieces for it. Excuse me. And Ephraim said, we're not going to have this money like this. 400 pieces is not going to come between us. You take the land, you have it, it's yours. And he gave him that land. Abraham gave him the 400 pieces of silver. The whole local town was aware now that this belongs to Abraham. All of this he had for the rest of his life to place his wife in the very best that he had. I mean, it sounds like when you're sitting there, but no, that's an accolade to what he felt, the love for her, the deepness of the love he had for her. The lesson continues to talk about and bring out some things that Now everybody in the town recognized this to be now Abraham's land. She was the first to be buried in Canaan. And some takeaways on this lesson. Again, as I said, this whole lesson this week is going to show the mercy and the faithfulness of the Lord. Everything he does. I mean, Brother Leland talked about how the faithfulness of stopping Abraham and Abraham's faithfulness of trusting the Lord. I just think this is a reminder to us that if we give all we have, he will do no less for us and more and more. That's what we have to remember. We can't give him enough to pay him for what he's done and will do for us if we submit. So another takeaway is that remember Sarah, he loved her so much, he wanted to do the very best for her. But if you remember in Genesis, when I think it's Genesis 11:29, when the Lord told him, Abram, you must leave, go to a land you know not where. Who went with him? Sarai was there. She was from beginning to the very end. Even though they had some differences, as couples do, they were still in God's favor. Even though Abraham yielded to some things that he should not have with Sarai, when it comes to Hagar, not believing that the Lord is going to keep his promise to them, God still forgave them and still blessed them. Even blessed Hagar, telling her, you got to go back to stand, represent who you truly are. God is so good. He's so merciful. That reminds me when we get caught up of not doing what we're promised to do, yield to Caesar what is Caesar's. God knows what's right and wrong. You do what's right until it contradicts what God has told you to do. And he will bless you. Another takeaway that I thought was quite interesting was the fact that God kept his promise. Even though they were old, they got their son, Isaac. He kept his promise. And again, as a reminder, he let them live long enough, Sarah, of course, to see her baby grow up into a grown man, not to get married, but to grow up into a grown man. 1 Peter 3:5 is a reminder of how much the Lord loved them and forgave them as they obeyed him. It talks about that both of them was recognized, and this is in Peter, 1 Peter 3:5, and I'm paraphrasing, both recognized as a blessing from God. Sarah was recognized as a blessing because she obeyed her husband as he obeyed God. I think it's important that we understand what I just said. A lot of times where I'm not going to submit to it, she obeyed her husband as he obeyed God, which calls her to be a blessing to him as God blessed Abraham. She was a part of those blessings. And for that, to the end of her life, God will keep his promise to them that they both will be in the kingdom of the Lord based on their faithfulness. I submit to you that this can be our life even now, individually, as a couple. This can be our life. We need to yield to this submission to the Lord and trust him to do what he has promised us to do. So I pray your strength in the Lord. Brother Leland?
Leland, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. There was an interesting story there that she probably knew what was going on, but it's not really mentioned in the scripture that she had led along. But he established a permanent land holding when he buried her there that he had been a sojourner for all of these years. And now he had, I guess you would call it, roots in the way that we look at things. So, and as far as that goes, I think that in our next lesson, we talk a little bit about what that means to have that permanent place. Michael, can you give us a little bit about a wife for Isaac?
Absolutely. And yes, I'm going to pick up where Susan so carefully and eloquently left us off here. There's an important connection between Sarah's death and the next part of the story. And there's a lot that goes on in Genesis chapter 24, the next chapter. And what I will focus on is the connection between Sarah's death and Isaac's marriage to Rebekah and Eliezer's prayer. So the prayer is sort of the meat between the bread of the sandwich of the story. So we initially see Abraham very concerned about Isaac not marrying a Canaanite woman. Why is that? And again, it's a great point. from nomad to a permanent place. He was living as a nomad with his family and all his stuff and then in death, he has a permanent place. What does that have to do with his, can we say, obsession with Isaac not marrying a Canaanite woman? Well, recall that Abraham wanted some land so that he could bury Sarah, as we saw. God had promised that Abraham's descendants would have the land. So it shouldn't surprise us that Abraham would not want the promised son, Isaac, to settle outside the promised land. And we'll get more into that in a moment, because there is another connection that chapter 24 ends on a connection between Sarah and Rebecca. But we need to get Rebecca into the story first. Well, what's inspiring about Isaac and Rebecca's marriage is that it is founded on prayer. And you know what they say about that family that prays together, right? What also is inspiring and maybe even astonishing is how the Bible records Rebecca was picked. Was it presumptuous for Eliezer to be so specific about the criteria for the bride? Is it ever appropriate to test God in this way? Well, that can be its own discussion, and let's talk about it during Sabbath school, shall we? In live Sabbath school. But for now, however you come out on that, the story is incredible in a good way, really. Even Eliezer may have been surprised about how it all came out. No matter what those parameters were, we can say that they were quite specific and illustrate the power of prayer. And he is praying in a way that we should conclude is appropriate. So we find it starting in verse 12. First, Eliezer rightly addresses God as his personal and historical God. Those are accurate ways to relate to our Creator, Elohim and Yahweh, as we talked about at the beginning of this quarter. He is a personal God, and he is also historical fact, a powerful God, Elohim, who created the heavens and the earth as an historical fact. Second, Eliezer rightly again asks for a successful mission. We want God to bless our efforts with the right motives here. The Hebrew captures what he is asking for. Hakre, give me success, O Lord. There's an interesting play on words once again, and Leland, Moriah itself is a beautiful play on words. God will himself provide the sacrifice. Can be literally happened and also literally happened later on in the story of the Bible, right? So here's another example, because the word give me success derives from another word, kare, which means to happen by chance. And that's why I kind of was going into Eliezer's prayer a bit, setting up such specific parameters that it would take something more than just chance to have everything to fall into place. It's a really way to see whether God's hand is in it. Anyway, but the interesting thing is that kara, the word for chance, is accurate for what Eliezer is doing and for what he's asking for. He's setting very specific parameters that from a human perspective can only be left to chance or divine intervention. Our God can and did make it happen if it is his will. And we know with hindsight that it was his will. So I would suggest to us that Eliezer, we know about tempting the Lord, and that's the word tempt there comes from a translation meaning to tempt or to test in an unrealistic or inappropriate way. It is okay to test the Lord because he invites us to do so with our tithes and offerings, for example, and he invites us to reason with him. It's wrong to test him to an unwarranted degree, as prior lessons have pointed out. But here, Eliezer is testing the Lord in a way that is, may I suggest, not prohibited by the Bible. But back to the story. What are Eliezer's parameters? The text shows that Eliezer determines the moment of the event, right here, right away, by the well of the water where he stands and where he has made his camels kneel down. That, of course, as you know, is a part of the story as well. It's not just a drink for him, but a drink for his animals too. So the bride-to-be must let her pitcher, let it down to him who from her perspective is a stranger, but also must offer a drink to his camels. So maybe in Eliezer's mind, having all these parameters met will determine whether God is really behind the pick. So making it happen would require, as we've talked about, a supernatural intervention that we, again, have to be very careful with how we do that if we're trying to apply it to our lives, because we know that the devil too can perform miracles. But the parameters, to be fair to Eliezer, the parameters that he set is also a test of character. The woman who gives the drink in the way that he's praying about would be someone who has to be generous, who has to be kind, hospitable, strong, and willing to go above and beyond. And when I say strong, I don't mean that just in an emotional sense, but also physically under the criteria here, because the pitcher, as we learned from the text, is actually on her shoulder. That's why she actually has to go down to offer the drink. So there is some strength, physical strength that's part of the equation here. And the Bible happily reports to us that Eliezer's prayer is fulfilled in Rebekah to a T. Behold, the word says in introducing her. The reference to the pitcher on her shoulders actually mirrors Eliezer's request to God. And the good news for Isaac is that she is qualified to marry him under not just Eliezer's standards, but Abraham as well. So the Bible tells us that Eliezer hurries to her. This is at verse 17. Can we imagine him being surprised by the fulfillment of his own prayer? He's seeing the woman meeting all the parameters. We read in verse 21 that the servant, without saying a word, so maybe this is all in his mind here, watched her closely, whether the Lord made his journey successful. Remember that concept again, that he is praying for success and how that ties to chance here. But of course, chance that is divinely intervened. So only when Rebekah arrives, or when he arrives at Rebekah's house. So of course, Rebekah arrives at the scene and they have their exchange, they meaning Rebekah and Eliezer. It goes back to Rebekah's house. Does he know for sure whether he was successful on his mission? She is the real deal. She is the complete package here. And as we fast forward a little bit in the text here, although we see that it is God's plan for Rebekah to follow Eliezer to marry Isaac, important point here is that she still had a freedom of choice to back out, even in the context of God's will. God does not force himself on anybody. The biblical text actually records the thing that she had a chance to back out of this. At verse 58, Rebekah is asked whether she will go with this man. This is again referring to going back with Eliezer to meet Isaac. And her answer was, I will go. I will go. There are others in our Bible who say something very similar to God's will, don't they? And the chapter closes with her meeting Isaac. He brings the bride into his mother Sarah's tent. This is where we go back to where we started here in this chapter. The Bible tells us that Rebekah comforts her husband, and this is at verse 67, after his mother's death. So we saw how difficult it was on Abraham. Sure, it was difficult for Isaac as well. Isaac's moving his bride into Sarah's tent notes that Rebekah provided comfort, and that suggests that she was providing comfort in a painful moment that Isaac still feels. Again, she is the real deal. Rebekah's the real deal. She's the complete package, the answer, quite literally, to prayer. With all this, we can better understand why the right bride was so important to Abraham, the tie to the land, why that was so important to Abraham. We see the connection between Sarah's death, Eliezer's prayer, and Isaac's marriage to Rebekah. Leland, I'll hand it back to you to push the story forward.
Yes, that's a wonderful story, and Isaac was saved by God as finding another sacrifice, and God provided him safety again and providing him with Rebekah. I think that's a wonderful story. And we move on to Thursday now, and we're talking about a wife for Abraham and what that means to the end of this week's stories. Vera, can you tell us a little about this?
Sure. So Abraham, we've heard, has gone through grieving Sarah, and now his son has married and is starting his married life. And I'm going to say Abraham is a little bit empty nesting here. And feeling a little bit lonely himself. I have heard, and it's not always consistent, but people who've had good marriages tend to remarry because of just being close to someone. Sometimes it's the complete opposite, but often when you're in a good marriage and your partner is gone, you get to a point where you just need that closeness again. And so this is the same. This is what's going on with Abraham. So if you turn to Genesis 24, and we've already read about Isaac taking Rebekah to Sarah's tent, and then it says, now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. And Jokshan became the father of Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letushim, and Lumin. And the sons of Midian were Ephah and Epher and Hanok and Abida and Eldaah. So he had a bunch more kids. So we know that one, God promised that he would have, he would be the father of many nations, but he also talks about the seed that would come from him. And that was directly attributed to coming from Isaac. So now he has tons of kids. And if you hear some of those words, you can kind of hear some of the peoples that were always fighting with the Israelites. And so just hang that there a minute. So interestingly, he marries Keturah, and I found this interesting because it says that he took Keturah as his wife, and then later, when they're talking about him preparing for his death, they kind of refer to her as a concubine and relating her as equivalent to Hagar. So I'm not quite sure. Some think that Keturah is Hagar. I was a little bit surprised by that in this lesson. So these are the questions that are before us that we can maybe discuss, as Michael said, when we're in live Sabbath school. But in my mind, they're two different people because they have two different names. But in relation to inheritance laws, right? He is now preparing his will, basically. So everything is going to be going to Isaac, and then he allocates gifts to all of his sons and the people who are close to him, so I thought this was, I saw the will aspect of it, and I thought that was very interesting. And he actually sends all of his family away, so Keturah and all of his sons and everybody away, because he doesn't want there to be fighting over money or lands or any of that stuff. And he wants it very clear who the inheritor is. And he's trying to eliminate fighting amongst the various siblings and anybody who feels like they have a right to his stuff, basically. So he's trying to get everything in order. He knows that he's going to be dying soon, so he's trying to get everything in order. He sends his family away, except for Isaac. And he prepares for his death. So interestingly, this plot of land where he set roots, he is then buried with Sarah. And again, the love story where he wants to stay with his beloved wife. He is buried there with her. And interestingly, while he sent his family away, it is both Ishmael and Isaac who are there at the burial. So I was reading a little bit about Ishmael. And interestingly, Hagar like throws wives at him like crazy. And so here I see this contrast, right? So Ishmael is actually promised also to have nations come from him. And his mom is throwing wives at him. And again, it's women who are bringing in idolatry and not loving God and into his home. And keep in mind, he grew up his first 13 years as the promised child. He was raised to know God and love God. We see with Abraham's servants, who he trusted very deeply to go find a wife for Isaac, also had a deep love for God and saw in evidence the truth of who God was, and he loved God as well. So we know that Abraham's example did infiltrate this land, right? He was highly respected, and wherever he went, people wanted to give him things, and God was really, he was very, he knew whether he should take things or not take things. And for this, like roots, as Leland has stated, it was very important for him to not just take from somebody, but that he does and make an investment, that he doesn't take things as gifts, but that he really exhibits integrity and honesty and truth and the fruits of the Spirit. And so we see this in Abraham's life. So interestingly, again, coming back to Ishmael, he is with this family who has, brought in idolatry and whatnot. And he sort of begins to separate himself towards the end of Abraham's life and at the end of his life, and began to again reconnect with Abraham's God and not want to be a part of all of this fighting and and so I found it very interesting that both Ishmael and Isaac were present at his burial. So to me, I think there was a level of peace that came between the two brothers, even though the families were probably still feuding and carrying on the bitterness that was there. The brothers themselves, I think, centered around God and the faith that Abraham had set the example. So but still, because we bring in, God was, Abraham was wanted someone who was God-centered to come as a wife to Isaac, probably because he witnessed in the other children, both Ishmael and his other children, the wives that they were taking. And he was probably like, oh my goodness gracious. And so he, at least with Ishmael, right? The other kids weren't born yet, but he's seeing how they're choosing wives. And so he's really interceding for them. And I see in Ishmael a change of heart. I don't know about the other kids. I have a hard time believing Keturah and Hagar are the same person, but there is the theory out there, so I'm just throwing it out for you to investigate. I will investigate it further as well. But I just see too that, in all of it, he loved the Lord. And in even his old age, right? He takes on another wife and has a bunch of kids. He has that empty nester. And so now he creates another family. Nothing like blended families to create a little chaos in the world. But ultimately, he loved the Lord. And let me also say through this lesson, I have always seen through Moses' life the transformation journey that took him to that place where he was glowing white as he came down the mountain, right? And everybody was afraid of him. So now I see with Abraham, oops, my camera is going, but hopefully you still hear me. I see with Abraham a similar transformation where he he has gone through journeys where he's not trusted God, not known what to expect, and then all of a sudden we have him being tested with his, having to sacrifice his son, and even throughout the end of his life, this journey of faith for Abraham of trusting the Lord. And you see these major transformations that really change his walk with the Lord. And I've always known him as a man of faith, but now I see his journey of the faith, his journey of faith, and the transformation that God had in his life. So amazing story of Abraham. And again, fulfillment of the prophecy that God gave him, that he would die in old age and live, a good life. And he did. And it just goes to the saving grace of God, evidence in every stage of his life. And he's amazing. God is amazing. And God loved Abraham. And God loves us as well and wants to walk with us at all stages of our life, whether we're considering marriage or remarriage, or we're going through grief, or, all of these stages of life. God was faithful to Abraham, and he is faithful to us as well. So thank you, Leland.
Thank you very much. You covered that and a lot more. So it was very, very, very interesting. This lesson group that we had this week was, in fact, it's a captivating set of lessons, and in some cases divergent. I mean, we started out with the birth of Isaac, the promised son. Then we had the test on Mount Moriah for the faithful heart, what was really his truthful heart. And like you said, Vera, he had to work to get to that point, Abraham. The transformational process that we all go through on a daily basis is a perfect example of it. You can go up and you can go down, but you need to always be working to be better. And after God was satisfied, and he sent the ram as a substitute sacrifice. So we found that that God had a plan even then for Abraham and for Isaac, the true faith that they had. In the death of Sarah, we talked about that. It was wonderfully covered. Just so many things in this lesson. When Isaac was favored with Rebekah, and I use the word favored, God again provided for Isaac, as I mentioned earlier. And the marriage was a healing process. And finally, Abraham remarried, but as Sister Vera said, there was so much more to it than just remarrying. And he did live and die as promised at a good old age. So in a few chapters, Genesis 22 through 25, the character of Abraham and his family are chronicled in the Word. So I would like to say that we have live church services beginning at 10 a.m. today. And today we will have a message that's really around a panel discussion concerning don't give the enemy a seat at your table. I think that'll be a very interesting thing to observe and listen to today. And after services, be reminded that we also have adult Sabbath school. doctrinal classes, children's lessons, and I believe we're starting a new book study, a new book class study also this week. So an eventful lesson this week. I enjoyed all of it. I hope that our viewers have enjoyed it too. And I would enjoin you to please join us today for worship. I thank you very much and God bless.